Okay, now let's move on to chapter 4 of stock lent at interest. The key points of this chapter. First, we will talk about the nature of stock lent at interest, and then discuss what regulates interest rate, followed by a discussion on the legal rate of interest, and lastly, how interest rate and price of land were related. So first, the nature of stock lent at interest. It is a capital to the lender for sure, right? Because it generates a revenue, which is the interest for the lender. It may or may not be a capital to the borrower, right? Because sometimes the borrower does not borrow the money to employ the money in such a way to generate revenue, but use it for other purposes. But most likely, it would be capital to the borrower as well, right? Because think about it, the borrower needs to pay back both the principal and the interest. If he always borrowed to spend, then there's no way he can keep paying the interest. He will just ruin himself financially. So most likely it is a capital to both the borrower and the lender. And a loan, in essence, you can see it as a right, the right to use a certain proportion of the annual produce of the nation, right? And interest can be seen as the fee being paid to exercise this right, right? So that's an interesting way of seeing interest and loan. Pun not intended. So how is interest rate regulated? So interest rate is regulated by the amount, right? Or should I say the part of the annual produce, which the owner does not employ it personally, but rather have somebody else employ it, but rather willing to have somebody else employ it, right? This is just my own thought, right? Perhaps the owner does not have enough bandwidth to manage this part of his stock, or he just doesn't have enough knowledge to employ it in a certain sector, right? So it's better to have somebody knowledgeable employ it and taking interest from it rather than employ it himself. And this part of annual produce, right, which owners do not employ personally, it grows as the whole quantity of stock increases. An interest rate falls, right, as the quantity of stock to be lent increases, right? For two reasons. One simple reason of demand of supply, right? Because well, if the lenders, right, they have more money to lend, and if the borrowers have the same desire, right, the same demand for money to be lent, then of course the supply being increased, the demand being the same, the price would be lower. And in this case, the price is interest. But that's not the only reason. The other reason is, as explained in book 1, chapter 9, right, profits of stock. The competition, right, between capitals, right, between the employers would force the employers of these capital to sell cheaper, or sometimes even buy dearer, and also to raise the wages to compete for labor. So see, they are selling cheaper, and then also the wages of labor going higher. That leaves little room for profits, right? So profits decreases as stock increases, right? And interest being regulated by profit, right? if profit falls, interest rate will fall, right? Just a recap from chapter 9 of book 1, right? Interest is whatever the creditor can take from the borrower, right? If the borrower can only make a small profit, then the creditor, right, the lender cannot demand too high of an interest because the borrower would not be able to pay for that, right? It doesn't make sense. And lastly, the increase in gold and silver supply does not reduce interest rate, right? Because keep everything else the same, the increase in quantity of gold and silver can only reduce the value of gold and silver, right? The actual amount of capital, right, would not change. And thus profit and interest won't change either. And I think the reason why he pointed this out is because the increase in gold and silver supply, right, coincided with the reduce of interest rate in European history, right? So after this discovery of the South Spanish American mines, gold and silver supplies skyrocketed in Europe and also all over the world. And in the same time, Europe was progressing in industry, right? Stock is being increased, national wealth is being increased, profit is being reduced, interest rate is being reduced. So these two events happen at the same time, leading to some people thinking that somehow the increase in gold and silver supply led to the reduce of interest rate. And Adam Smith pointed out, no, that's not the case. And some comment on the legal rate of interest. The prohibition of interest increases the evil of usury. Why is that, right? That's because, think about it, now the debtors, right, they need to compensate the creditors, not just the normal interest rate, but also paying them to compensate for the risk of breaking the law by accepting the interest. So the prohibition of interest will actually increase interest higher than its natural rate. And then what should be the legal rate of interest then, right? Adam Smith stated that the maximum rate of interest should be slightly above the market rate on people with good security. So why only slightly above? Why not far above, right? So think about it. If it's far above, right, then any people with sanity would not be willing to take these loans, right, due to the high interest. It's only the high risk lovers, right, the speculators and prodigals, right, spendthrift, is that the word? Anyways, only these people would be willing to take these loans with very high interest rate, right? And if you have legal rate of interest such high, then a good portion of the usage, right, of the annual produce of a nation, the right to use them would go to these people and be wasted. And that's not good for the accumulation of national wealth, right? Money should not be go to the hands of these people. And what if the interest rate is below this market rate? Then it just simply won't work, right? Who the fuck would be able to would be willing to lend money at a loss, right? Nobody would be willing to do so. So, for example, in France, the French king attempted to reduce interest rate from 5% to 4% by an edict in 1766. But interest rate stayed at 5%, and the law being evaded in multiple ways. Um, yeah. So a good example would be what happened in Great Britain, right? Money lent to the government at 3%, and to people with good credit at 4 to 4.5%. And the legal rate is in Great Britain being 5%, and the law was being respected, and usury not too common. And last slide, last topic in this chapter, interest rate and land price. Um, so that's, I guess, interesting sneak peek into real estate market back in the 1700s and also in the Middle Ages. Yeah, the medieval times. So a person who wished to derive revenue from capital without employing it personally has two choices, whether to lend it to somebody else and take the interest, or buy land and take the rent. Right. So from this point of view, uh, loan versus land, they are really substitute goods for people with capital and do not wish to employ it themselves personally. And interest rate actually regulates land prices, or should I say, affects land prices, right? So in medieval time, when interest rate was about 10%, uh, land was sold at 10 to 10 and 12-year purchases. So you can see it as a higher return on investment, right? You only pay 10 or 12 years rent to get this piece of land, and then you can keep taking rent forever, right? So the return on investment is relatively high. Right? Why is that? Because you see the interest rate is higher, right? Then land would have to offer high return to be a good alternative to lending, right? And then when interest rate fall to 4 to 6%, land price rose to 20, 25, and 30 years purchase, right? So that means the return on investment for buying land is lower, right? Now you have to invest a lot more upfront. Then you can start taking rent forever, right? Why is that? Because now interest rate has fall, right? Then landowners, right, those people who sell land now they are enabled to sell land much more expensively, right? Because, well, people with spare money to land, they now do not have land or buy land, right? They don't have very good alternatives. Yeah, so those who sell land can offer lower return on investment and still be able to sell it. Okay, to recap, right? The amount of capital which the owner does not invest themselves, does not uh, employ personally, determines the interest rate, right? And then the amount of interest, the maximum rate of interest should be slightly above the market rate. And lower interest rate, higher land price, higher interest rate, higher interest rate, lower land price. Land and loan being substitute goods. Okay, that concludes chapter 4.